In the following presentation, I will cover key elements and principles of dual wet in development cooperation. On the agenda, we have a short background on types of wet systems that I will go into. I will then cover dimensions of dual wet, share a few important points on the role of business sector in dual wet, and end with some strategic entry points for dual wet in development cooperation, together with the business sector. Now to the background. The way how a wet system is characterized depends a lot, of course, on societal, economic, and political frame conditions. In many countries, there is no tradition that the private sector be as part of the responsibility to educate and train skilled workers. Education, including wet, is quite often seen as a unilateral responsibility of the state. And these are contexts where we usually deal with school-based wet offers as given in the left box on the graph. In other contexts, for example, in sector-specific subsystems or in training offers for adults, we might have a situation where the state is more or less absent and the training and certification procedures are largely unregulated. These might include systems where wet is organized on the job, given in the box on the right side of the graph, as kind of two extremes that we could find in reality. The two systems, school-based wet and on-the-job learning, are then what we could call pure types that we might encounter, and dual wet stands in between the two poles, incorporating elements of school-based wet and on-the-job learning. That allows the dual system to well link the world of education and the world of work, as given in the second graph. Dual wet systems are generally considered as highly labor market relevant, also due to the shared responsibility between public and private actors. That's just on the background. Let's go now into the dimensions of dual wet. Even though the core principles of dual wet are certainly easy to understand, but also very difficult to realize, quite often we found that the concepts behind the terms are often unclear. For understanding each other in our professional contexts across the globe, it is most important to work with clear terms and concepts. The concept of dual wet has at least three dimensions we should separate. First is the organizational, institutional dimension, what we call the dual wet system. The second is the pedagogic dimension, what we call the dual concept. And the third is the societal dimension that we call the professional concept. I will go into the organizational and institutional dimensions and into the pedagogic dimension afterwards. For the societal dimension, it shall be enough to say that in countries with a dual wet system, wet is closely tied to the concept of profession and pride therein. The qualifications achieved by dual wet programs are comprehensive in these cases and generally associated with a notion of high quality and skilled work. Let's go now into the organizational institutional dimension, or what we call the dual wet system. As you can see on this slide, we can separate several defining components of the organizational institutional dimension, or what we call characteristics of a dual wet system. The first one would be ownership. Dual wet is a shared responsibility by public and private partners in a proper dual wet system, as I said in the very beginning. The second are the two learning venues. Training is held at two learning venues, sometimes even three. The classroom-based component provides theory and general education, while the business component is where hands-on knowledge and skills are gained. So-called branch training centers might complement the business sector part and constitute a third learning venue. The third dimension would then be the ratio of learning the business to learning in the classroom. So where do you spend your time actually when learning? In countries with a dual VET system, youngsters spend 3 to 4 days at work and 1 to 2 days at school. The donor committee has agreed on a 50% minimum threshold for dual projects. So learning at work should cover at least half of the time you'd spend in programs. Fourth, the status of trainees. In dual VET, businesses recruit trainees who then become employees with a special employment contract, what is often called the apprenticeship contract. So it is not the schools or anybody else that recruits the trainees. And fifth, the duration of training. In countries with dual VET systems, again, the training usually lasts between 2 to 4 years. This is due to the high level of professional competence aimed for in these contexts, but also due to the time needed for professional socialization. So to be a proper professional, it takes some time to develop all the habits and your self-understanding. It is only based on a certain minimal duration that you can achieve such a minimal level of comprehensiveness of the competencies that shall be developed. Again, the DCD-VET defined for programs in development cooperation a minimum standard that would be 1 year. Let's go on with the pedagogic dimension, or what we call the dual concept. The pedagogic dimension of dual VET covers what we call that dual concept. It addresses the alternation between classroom and practical learning. On the slide, you can find the two extremes again, like school-based VET and on-the-job learning, the two pure types that I explained to you before. The pedagogical approach of dual VET, the dual concept, is then given in variety of formats we find in reality. It can be realized in schools that include workshop-based training into their programs. It can be included or realized in types of offers that work with well-defined internships. To say that internships that do have some sort of a curricula, or at least defined targets and defined durations and framework conditions. We also find the dual concept realized in what we know as formation en alternance. So that is a concept similar to the apprenticeship, but with blocks of training happening for longer durations. So you would spend a longer time in one place and then again a longer time, for example, in the business and the school. And in what we call formal apprenticeship, obviously. The dual concept does not apply, however, to school-only VET offers without practice, and it does not apply neither in traditional or informal apprenticeships and in pure on-the-job learning approaches. This might sound a bit trivial to you, but I think it's important to understand, as we see on the next slide. Because as a takeaway from what I just shared with you, we can conclude that the dual concept can be realized and used as a pedagogical approach in settings that do not necessarily comply with characteristics of a dual VET system. The dual system, or the dual VET system, organizes training processes applying an approach of shared responsibilities between public and private sector, to cut it really short. The dual concept describes the pedagogical approach applied for training, the alternation between and combination of theory and practice. So you really have to know what you talk about when you talk about dual VET. Are you talking about systems or the dual concept, the pedagogical approach? The dual VET system has to be organized according to the dual concept on the pedagogical level. However, you can easily imagine to organize your training according to the dual concept, but without a dual system being in place. This is also what we often find in development cooperation, where many projects apply the dual concept, so the pedagogy behind, For example, in labor market integration programs or in special needs groups programs, without actually going through or working with or inside a dual VET system. That said, I want to now share some basic thoughts on engaging the business sector in VET. As we have seen before in the poll, this is still not very often the case, so that's why I want to go a bit deeper into that. First, I want to share something on the roles of the business sector in VET. The business sector can take at least 4 roles that we should differentiate. The first one would be as a decision maker, obviously, to be involved in strategic panels and in all sorts of platforms where decisions are being taken. Provider of expertise, for example, in curriculum development or any other sort of development exercise. As a financer, be it as someone that finances their own programs inside, or financer by, for example, paying levies. Workplace provider for training as a last role he or could take. It is most important to understand that these roles are interrelated as shown on this graph. If you want to develop or change one role of the business sector, which often happens, you have to ensure that the overall role sharing in VET remains coherent and accepted. For example, you cannot expect the business sector to pay, but not to have a say in what is being done with the funds. This is just a very simple example, but it is also a learning we could take from many examples around the world where systems actors are constantly struggling with such issues. The acceptable and realizable role sharing depends on the situation, however. The resources of the actors, needs, so the resources of the actors are important also for finding a well-balanced role sharing, which needs to be negotiated. And it is rarely actually the same. So the role sharing looks different wherever you go. Let me now go one step further into the analytical reference framework I just presented to you before, with these 2 extremes and dual VET in the middle. Based on the typical starting points, left and right, we in DCD VET put together some promising approaches when engaging with the business sector and group them in areas of engagement, as you can see here on the slide. So it's several areas of engagement, either working from left to the middle or from right to the middle, depending on the initial situation you find. In these areas of engagement, and by applying one or several of the approaches, we could envisage to develop the roles of the business sectors as shown before in VET, developing further into a dual type or system. When doing that, the process of change is very important, indicated by the arrows. These processes need time, negotiation, and testing. The DCD VET study on engaging the business sector provides much detail on exactly these areas of engagement and strategies. Just to end my presentation, I want to share some entry points with you. So, strategic entry points, how you could engage the business sector in reality. We developed these entry points together with most senior dual VET specialists back in 2016 when we started the donor committee. So on the next slide, you see these entry points. One possible entry point is to dualize non-formal VET programs run by medium or large-scale enterprises. Often these enterprises run their own programs and find it challenging, actually. So through inter-firm cooperation, programs could be dualized, standardized, or even formalized. Another option is to work through pioneering companies, or even also as a third option, the organized business sector, depending on who actually has the power, resources, and interest to develop together with you some innovative approaches. Sometimes it is rather single companies, the first option. Sometimes it's rather a well-organized business sector representative. The common ground for these two is that usually they also find it difficult to identify competent staff, and they might want to address these issues. Another option is to work with private or public training institutes or schools. So it can come from the other side, where you have a state-driven system with schools being really at the heart of the system. And you can then work with well-networked schools that have certain resources to develop into dual. These schools need a certain autonomy to do that. So usually if you just try to do something like that with schools that don't have autonomy in the system, it might be a fail then. Another option is that many countries do have some experience with apprenticeship actually, but rather in a traditional or informal setting. Such approaches could be dualized by adding a classroom component. There is lots of experience around on that. There is an ILO guide on that. There is also lots of quite mixed experience around regarding these approaches, I have to say. In the last option, development could also be driven by policymakers. That could be national policymakers, regional policymakers, or also international partners that quite often drive the agenda. So if there is a national policy that defines dual VET as an option, you could take it from there and support partners in developing dual VET approaches in these countries.